On the morning of December 19th, 1886, Arthur Grayson knelt in the snow outside a wooden door set into a cliff face, and he understood for the first time in his 55 years what it felt like to have been completely wrong. His beard had frozen solid. He could no longer feel his fingers. Behind him, his son Owen stood with his shoulders bowed under the weight of 12 hours of walking through cold that had no business existing on this earth. The smoke rising from the crack in the sandstone above them was barely visible against the gray Montana sky. But it was there. Fire, warmth, life. Arthur raised his fist to knock. The door opened before he made contact. Vera Whitfield stood in the entrance. She was thin from 2 months of rationing, but her color was good, and her eyes were clear, and her posture was straight in a way that made Arthur feel, despite everything, like the smaller person. Behind her, warmth pressed outward into the frozen air like a hand being offered. She looked at him and said nothing. She waited for him to speak first, and in that silence, Arthur Grayson felt the full weight of the previous 4 months settle onto his chest. 4 months earlier, he had stood in the church of Elkhorn Creek and told this girl she knew nothing about Montana winters. He had been wrong about everything. This is where the story ends. Now let us go back to where it began. September 30th, 1886. The air carried the first serious bite of autumn, the kind that reminds a man that the pleasant months are numbered. The mountains to the north were a thin cap of early snow, and the aspens along the creek had turned to gold overnight. Josiah Whitfield had been dead for 14 months. He had been a tall, quiet man who kept to himself and to his 200 acres on the North Ridge, and who had a habit of watching the sky and the animals and the water in ways that made the settled people of Elkhorn Creek uncomfortable. He had come to the valley 20 years earlier with nothing but a horse, a hand tool, and a journal he had inherited from his own father, and he had built something real out of raw Montana wilderness. The land was good land. Everyone knew it. The timber stand on the north slope was the finest in the valley, and the spring that ran year-round through the lower pasture produced the cleanest water for 20 miles in any direction. When Josiah died in a climbing accident in the summer of 1885, he left behind 2 daughters, 200 acres, and 3 things that the people of Elkhorn Creek did not consider valuable. The first was a hunting knife he had carried for 20 years, the handle worn smooth by use, the blade maintained with the kind of daily attention that reveals a man's character more honestly than any sermon. The second was a journal handwritten across 300 pages filled with observations about weather and animals and the behavior of water and the movement of clouds. The third was a wolf hybrid named Flint, gray-coated and amber-eyed, who had been with Josiah since puppyhood and who now followed Vera Whitfield with the loyalty of a creature that understands loss in its bones. Vera wore the knife in a leather sheath at her hip. The people of Elkhorn Creek saw this as evidence of wildness. Vera saw it as the last remaining connection to her father. She was 19 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's storm-colored eyes, and she carried herself with a stillness that people tended to mistake for coldness until they looked more carefully and realized it was something else entirely. It was the stillness of a person who has learned to read the world rather than react to it. Her sister Della was 17, softer in her features with their mother's gentle mouth and a way of moving through the natural world that seemed almost like conversation. She had been born with a gift for animals that went beyond training or patience. It was something more fundamental, something that lived below language. Josiah had recognized it early and cultivated it carefully, teaching her everything he knew about the old ways of approaching wild creatures. Together, they had managed the Northridge property through the 14 months since their father's death. They had done it without complaint and without asking for help, which was both a matter of pride and a matter of necessity, because asking for help from Elkhorn Creek had not historically produced good results. On the morning of September 30th, Vera Whitfield Char walked into George Tate's general store with a warning. The store fell quiet when they entered. It always did. There was something about the Whitfield sisters that disrupted the ordinary rhythms of commerce and conversation, some quality they carried in from the wild places that the town had never been able to absorb or domesticate. Men who had been talking freely a moment before found things to examine on the shelves. Women who had been sharing confidences went suddenly occupied with their shopping. Vera did not take time to acknowledge the silence. She walked to the center of the room and she spoke. The beaver dams on the upper creek, she said, had been rebuilt to a height she had never seen before. 6 feet instead of the usual 3. The elk were moving down from the high country a full month ahead of schedule, and their coats were thick in a way that September had no right to produce. The woolly bear caterpillars were black from end to end, not a stripe of brown among them. The red-winged blackbirds had left 2 weeks earlier than any year she could remember. She had seen all of these signs in the same season once before. She said, in the journal her father had left her, the winter those signs preceded had killed men who should have survived it and spared those who prepared. Before anyone could respond, she noticed something in the far corner of the store. Walter Finch sat on the bench near the cold stove where he always sat, his trapper's hat pushed back on his white head, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He was 72 years old and had spent 50 of those years in these mountains. He had trapped and hunted and read the land through more winters than most men in Elkhorn Creek had been alive. When Vera's eyes found his, he gave a single, almost invisible nod. He had seen the same signs. He knew what they meant, and he said nothing. That nod was a small thing, barely the movement of muscle and bone, but Vera understood it completely. This was not a question of knowledge. Walter Finch knew. The question was, who in this town had the standing to speak a warning without being laughed out of the room? And both of them already knew the answer. Della spoke then, unable to stay quiet. She told them about the winter of 1879, about their father standing in the cold before anyone would listen, about the 17 people who had survived because they followed Josiah Whitfield's instructions and the families who had not. Margaret Hale stepped forward from the fabric bolts where she had been standing. She was 58 years old, a widow who had raised 4 children alone on a homestead that should have broken her and had not. She moved with the deliberate calm of a woman who has chosen her battles carefully and intends to win this one. She said she remembered 1879. She said that Josiah Whitfield had been right when every man in the valley was still arguing about whether to believe him. She said she had reinforced her roof when he told her to, and stocked her winter feed when he told her to, and her cattle had lived when others died, and she had never forgotten what that cost of unbelief had looked like on the faces of the families who lost people. That single act of speaking, one older woman stepping forward from the bolts of fabric to stand beside 2 girls that half the town had been talking about for years, changed the temperature of the room in a way that had nothing to do with weather. It forced Arthur Grayson to respond. Arthur was standing near the counter with 2 of his ranch hands. He was the most powerful man in Elkhorn Creek by most measures. His spread covered the best grazing land in the valley floor. His herd, recently expanded to 400 head on a bank loan he had taken out in July, was the pride of the county. He had lived in this valley for 35 years, and he had survived every winter it had thrown at him. And he was not, he told himself, going to be frightened by children's stories. What he did not tell anyone, what he barely admitted to himself, was the other fact sitting beneath all of that certainty like water under ice. He had borrowed heavily in July. Everything he had built, everything that bore his name, was staked on this winter being ordinary. He needed Vera Whitfield to be wrong. Dr. Frederick Sloan, who had come west from Philadelphia with a medical degree and a deep faith in modern methods, seconded Arthur's dismissal with the authority of science. He cited the Territorial Almanac. He cited weather reports from the Capitol. He used the word superstition twice and the word primitive once. And each time he said them, he looked at Vera and Della as though they represented everything that stood between civilization and the wilderness. Then Reverend Edmund Holt stood up, and the nature of the gathering shifted entirely. Holt was a man of perhaps 55, lean in the way of someone who has always been more comfortable with abstraction than with physical labor. He had a voice trained for authority and eyes that were always measuring. He had been the pastor of Elkhorn Creek's congregation for 11 years, and in that time he had accumulated influence the way some men accumulate land, quietly and with patience, one small transaction at a time. He reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the counter. Vera looked at that document. Then she looked at Holt's face, and she understood something that changed everything she thought she understood about this morning. That paper had been prepared in advance. It was not a response to her warning. It had existed before she walked through the door. The careful fold of it, the deliberate way he set it down rather than producing it in the heat of argument, the absence of any surprise in his expression, all of it told her the same thing. This was not a reaction. This was a trap, and she had walked straight into it. Holt spoke about legal ownership. He spoke about the absence of proper homestead filing, about the complexity of inheritance law as it applied to minors without guardianship, about the church's obligation to hold property in trust when clear ownership could not be established. He spoke with the measured cadence of a man reciting something he had rehearsed. Margaret Hale's voice cut through before he finished. When had he prepared that document, she asked. How long had he been planning this? The question landed in the room like a stone into still water. Holt met her eyes. He did not flinch. He said that it was the duty of the church to be prepared for all contingencies affecting the welfare of the community. Margaret pointed out in a voice that carried to every corner of the store that the Whitfield land bordered his own property on the eastern side, that it held the finest timber stand in the valley, that the spring on that land produced water that every rancher within 5 miles would pay dearly to access. Holt told her with the quiet menace of a man who has learned to make threats sound like observations that her position in the community was not so secure that she could afford to make accusations against men who carried the trust of the congregation. The threat was transparent and everyone heard it. Margaret Hale had a widow's mortgage on her property that the bank had been patient about for 2 years. Patient in the way that banks are patient when they are being managed from outside. Margaret Hale held Holt's gaze and said that she would speak what she knew to be true, regardless of the cost, and that some things were more important than security. Vera was watching all of this. She was watching the faces around her, measuring who would speak and who would not, calculating the arithmetic of the situation with the same precision her father had applied to reading weather. She was not surprised by Holt. She was not surprised by Sloan or by Arthur Grayson. She had expected something like this. What she had not expected was what she saw when she looked past Holt's shoulder. Samuel Holt was 16 years old, the Reverend's son, and he was standing behind his father with the expression of someone who has been told all his life that a particular wall is solid and has just put his hand through it. He was looking at his father's back with something that was not quite horror and not quite grief and not quite anger, but contained elements of all three. When Samuel's eyes found Vera's, they held for just a moment. In that moment, she read him completely. He knew. He had known for some time. How long she could not say. But he had known about the document before today. He had known about the land, about the planning, about the patient machinery his father had been running behind the face of pastoral concern, and he had said nothing. He had stayed in his father's house and eaten at his father's table and kept his knowledge locked inside him, and the expression on his face told her that the cost of that silence had just become something he could no longer afford. He looked away first. Arthur Grayson called for a vote. The outcome was settled before anyone raised a hand. The Whitfield property would be held in trust by the church until proper legal ownership could be established. Vera and Della Whitfield were to gather their personal effects and depart by dawn the following morning. They would be provided with supplies sufficient for travel to the territorial capital, where appropriate institutions for young women without family could be found. Billy Skaggs, who was 23 and thought that being the loudest voice in a room was the same thing as being right, offered $5 to anyone who would bet that their cave would collapse before Christmas. Laughter moved through the gathering like a wave. Vera looked at the faces around her one final time. Some avoided her eyes. Others wore the satisfied expression of people who believe they have solved a problem. A few, Walter Finch among them, looked at the floor with something she recognized as shame. She thought about arguing. She thought about everything her father had told her about standing for truth, even when truth was unwelcome. She thought about the document on the counter and the 11 years of quiet accumulation it represented, and she understood that argument was exactly what Holt needed from her. An argument could be managed, dismissed, used as evidence of the instability and unreasonableness he had been whispering about for months. She said nothing. She turned and walked out with Della behind her and Flint at her heel. Deputy Thomas Wren was standing near the door as she passed. He had been there the entire time, positioned in the corner in the way that lawmen learn to position themselves when they want to observe without participating. He was 35 and had been the deputy of Elkhorn Creek for 6 years, which meant he had watched that many years of the valley's politics and learned what could be said out loud and what could only be said in other ways. He did not look at her as she passed. He did not slow his pace or change his posture. But when Vera walked through the doorway, she heard his voice pitched at exactly the volume that went no further than her ear. "Halverson's old camp," he said, "east side of the rock shelf. The door's unlocked." 4 seconds later, he was across the room examining something on the shelf near the window, as though he had not spoken at all. Vera did not break stride. She did not look back. She filed the information away in the same part of her mind that stored her father's observations about water levels and animal behavior, the part of her mind that was always building a picture of what was true, regardless of what she was being told. That evening, she and Della returned to the house their father had built 20 years ago on the North Ridge. They did not speak much. There was not a great deal to say that the situation had not already said for them. Della found the silver bracelet in the bottom of their mother's trunk. It was a small thing worth nothing in any market, a thin band of hammered silver with a single twist worked into the metal. It was the last remaining object that had belonged to the woman who had died when Della was 11 and Vera was 13. Della put it on her wrist without comment. Vera watched her do it and said nothing, but she noted the gesture and what it meant in the way that older sisters track the interior lives of younger ones. Vera opened her father's journal. She did not open it at the beginning. She knew the early pages well enough to recite them from memory. She opened it to a section near the middle to entries made in the winter of 1862, when Josiah's own grandfather had scratched out a record of surviving the worst weather the Montana Territory had seen in living memory. The entry was specific in the way that practical men are specific when their lives depend on the details. Stone absorbs heat slowly during the daylight hours and releases it through the night, it read. A chamber carved 15 feet into good sandstone will hold a temperature between 50 and 58 degrees through the coldest weather, requiring only a small fire to push it higher. The walls do the work that wood cannot. This is how the old people survived what killed the newcomers who did not know how stone thinks. Vera read that entry twice. Then she closed the journal and put it in her pack with the knife and the 3 rabbit snares and the flint and steel and the small medicine kit that had been her mother's. She already knew what she was going to build. She already knew where she was going to build it. Everything her father had written in those 300 pages had been preparation for exactly this kind of night. And she felt the weight of that as something steady rather than heavy, the way a good tool sits in the hand before work begins. There was a knock at the door just before midnight. Samuel Holt stood in the darkness outside. He was shaking, and it was not from the cold. He was wearing an ordinary coat and ordinary boots, and he had clearly not planned this visit carefully, which meant it had not been planned at all, but had grown out of something that could no longer be contained. He held out a small bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside was a short-handled hammer and a coil of good rope, the braided kind that did not fray and held its knot under pressure. "My father does not know I am here," he said. Vera looked at him for a long moment. The expression on his face reminded her of the moment in the store when he had looked past his father's shoulder and understood something about the wall he had been leaning against. She recognized in that expression something she had felt herself at 13, standing over her mother's grave in the rain, learning for the first time that the world does not bend toward fairness simply because it should. "Thank you," she said. She did not say more than that. Samuel nodded once as though he had expected nothing more and was somehow relieved by the restraint. He turned and disappeared back into the dark. Vera set the hammer and rope with her pack. She did not allow herself to think about the injustice of the evening or the faces in the store or the document on the counter. The mountain was waiting, the stone was waiting, and the cold coming down from the north was not waiting for anyone's feelings about anything. They left before first light. Elkhorn Creek was silent in the pre-dawn dark. The houses shuttered, the horses standing in their stalls. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the grass crackled underfoot. Flint moved ahead of them down the track without being told, his nose working the cold air, his body language easy in the way of an animal moving toward rather than away. The Halverson camp was a small structure half buried in the hillside east of the main rock shelf, a trapper storage depot that had been abandoned 3 years earlier when old Halverson sold his stake and moved south. The door was unlocked as Wren had said it would be. Inside, they found axes, 2 good ones, and a set of chisels and a collection of iron wedges and several coils of wire and a handsaw that had been oiled against rust. Exactly the kind of equipment that 2 girls trying to carve a living space out of a sandstone cliff face would need and could not have carried from home without someone noticing. Vera was reaching for one of the chisels when she saw the piece of paper folded under it. The writing was brief. "Do not approach the land office. Holt has a man there. W." She read it twice. Then she put it in her coat pocket and did not mention it to Della until they were moving again, loaded with as much as they could carry, heading north into the foothills toward the old Hidfield hunting grounds, where the sandstone formations rose out of the hillside like the bones of something ancient. When she told Della about the note, Della was quiet for a moment. "So there is no legal path," Della said. "Not this winter," Vera said. "Then we need to make it to spring." "Yes, that is all." Vera had been thinking the same thing since she had read Wren's note, and hearing it stated plainly by her sister settled something in her. There was a clarity in it that the morning's injustice had been obscuring. They did not need to win. They needed to survive. They needed to stay alive and intact and capable through the worst that the season could throw at them. And in the spring, when the ground thawed and the legal mechanisms of the territory could function again, they would deal with Holt and his prepared documents and his plans that went back 3 years. But first, the mountain. They found the cliff formation in the early afternoon, a rise of red-gold sandstone catching the low September sun, layered and seamed in the way that good working stone presents itself to someone who knows how to read it. There was a natural crack in the face, wider at the top than the bottom, running 6 feet deep into solid rock, at a point where the cliff curved slightly inward, offering natural shelter from the prevailing wind. Vera set her hand flat against the cliff face and held it there for a long moment, feeling the residual warmth the stone had collected through the afternoon. Then she unslung her pack and found the hammer Samuel Holt had left at her door in the dark, set the iron chisel against the rock, and drove it in. The sound rang out across the quiet valley, sharp and clear, the sound of something beginning. Flint sat behind her in the fallen leaves and pricked his ears toward the horizon, listening for anything that did not belong to the ordinary noise of the wild places. Della set her own pack down beside her sister's and reached for the second chisel without being asked. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that the work itself would not answer better. Above them, the sky was the pale-washed blue of late September, and in it, the last of the red-winged blackbirds were moving south 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the aspens were losing their leaves faster than any autumn that either of them could remember. And somewhere up in the high country, the elk were already moving down with coats that should not have been that thick for another month. The mountain had been trying to say something for weeks. Vera Whitfield had been listening. The first week nearly broke her, and Vera Whitfield did not permit herself to acknowledge that fact until it was over. She measured progress the only way that mattered. Each evening before the light failed, she pressed her back against the far wall of the excavation and stretched both arms toward the opening. On the first evening, her fingertips reached the gap with room to spare. By the fourth evening, she had to step forward 6 inches before her hands found open air. By the end of the 7th day, she stood in a passage that was 6 feet deep and wide enough for 2 people to work side by side without their elbows touching. It was not enough. Not nearly, but it was measurable, and measurable meant real, and real meant possible. Her hands told a different story. The blisters on her palms had opened on the 2nd day and wept through the 3rd and 4th. By the 5th day, they had dried into a kind of raw, stinging armor that cracked when she flexed her fingers. By the 7th, the first calluses were forming over the worst of the damage. She did not mention this to Della. Della could see her hands perfectly well. What Vera did not say, what she kept entirely to herself during those first 7 days, was what she had seen on the third morning. She had been gathering pine nuts in the meadow below the cliff when she heard horses on the lower trail. Two riders moving at the deliberate pace of men who are measuring land rather than crossing it. She pressed herself into the shadow of a boulder and watched them pass not 200 yards below her position. One she did not recognize. The other was a man she had seen twice before at Holt's property, a hired hand who did the kind of work that Holt preferred not to be associated with directly. They carried stakes, the wooden kind used for marking survey lines. Vera watched them until they disappeared around the eastern bend. Then she climbed back up to the cliff face and picked up her chisel and did not stop working until the light was completely gone. She told Della that evening, not the fear of it, just the fact. Della absorbed the information the way she absorbed most hard news, quietly, with the stillness of someone running calculations. How long before they find the upper approach, she asked. 6 weeks, if they work methodically, Vera said. Less if someone points them in the right direction. Then we have 2 deadlines, Della said. The weather and them. Yes. They ate in silence after that, and the silence was not empty, but full of the kind of shared understanding that does not need words to exist. The accident happened on the 12th of October in the early afternoon, when the light was still good and the work had been going better than expected. Vera had been pushing deeper into the back of the excavation, following a seam in the sandstone that ran horizontal and clean, the kind of natural guide that made the work faster. She was focused on the seam and on the rhythm of chisel and hammer and the falling of stone chips around her feet. She saw the vertical crack in the ceiling above her at the precise moment she understood she had seen it the day before. She had noted it yesterday. She had looked at it and made a decision. Not a conscious one more, like a postponement, a choice not to stop and deal with a problem that would cost half a day to address when the seam in front of her was running so well. She had 1 second to understand what that decision had cost before the ceiling came down. She threw herself backward and felt the rush of displaced air as the slab dropped through the space her head had occupied. She hit the back wall hard enough to lose her breath. Then she was on the ground with dust and stone chips raining down and the sound of it echoing off the sandstone walls. Then Della screamed, not a sound of fear, a sound of impact. The smaller slab, perhaps 30 pounds of sandstone that had been riding on top of the main piece, had cut Della across the left leg just below the knee. Vera was across the space before the echo died, hauling stone with her bare hands, not feeling the skin coming off her knuckles until later. When she pulled the last piece free, Della was white in the face and breathing through her teeth. "Can you stand?" Della tried. She made it to one knee before her leg gave and Vera caught her. "Not today," Della said with the particular flatness of someone managing significant pain. Vera set her sister against the wall and looked at the leg, swollen badly and darkening already below the knee. Moving carefully, she worked through the examination her father had taught her. No bone ends, no unnatural angle, no grinding when she stabilized the joint and tested it gently. "Not broken," she said. Della said nothing to that. The distinction between broken and badly damaged was perhaps less meaningful from her current position. What Vera said next, she said once and did not repeat. "I saw that crack yesterday. I chose not to deal with it." Della looked at her. "This is my mistake. I am going to finish what we started, and you are going to heal. And when you can work again, you will work. Until then, you will do what you can from here." Della held her sister's gaze for a moment. Her expression was not forgiveness, and it was not absolution, and it was something better than both. It was recognition. "Then start," she said. "The weather is not waiting for either of us." For 10 days, Vera worked alone. She was up before first light and working in the cave by the time the sun touched the upper cliff. She worked until she could not lift her arms. 16 hours was not every day. Some days it was less when her hands had seized overnight and required an hour of careful movement before they would grip the chisel properly. Some days it was more when the stone was running clean and stopping felt like a crime. She did not think about Holt. She did not think about Arthur Grayson or the document on the counter or the survey stakes in the lower meadow. She permitted herself one small ration of anger at the beginning of each day, burning it clean in the first hour of work, and after that she thought only about the stone in front of her and the measurements she was trying to reach. Della was not idle. Propped against the cave wall with her leg extended, she wove snares from strips of rawhide with a speed and economy of motion that their father had spent years developing in her. She processed the dried herbs from their collected stores, separating and labeling, building the small medical reserve that she was already calculating they would need. She kept the fire at the lean-to burning so that Vera could work longer into the evening, and she sang. Old songs mostly. Their mother songs, the ones that had come with her from the east and had been sung in the kitchen of the Northridge house on winter evenings when the wind was loud outside and the lamp was lit inside. Songs without a great deal of meaning on their surface, carrying all their meaning underneath in the way that such songs do. Vera heard her sister singing and did not acknowledge it. But on the sixth day of working alone, when her hands began to shake uncontrollably at mid-afternoon, not from cold, but from the accumulated exhaustion of doing one violent physical thing over and over, for days without rest, she sat down in the dark of the excavation and listened to the sound of Della's voice coming through the stone, and she waited until the shaking stopped, and then she picked up the hammer and went back to work. Flint helped in his way. He ranged the meadow and the lower trails each day, and twice he had returned to camp due with the particular quality of alertness that meant he had found something worth reporting. The first time it was the scent trail of the survey party moving through the lower pasture. The second time Vera followed him to a ridge overlook and saw the same two riders stopped at the eastern boundary of the Whitfield property, one of them driving a stake into the frozen ground with a mallet. She watched them for a long time, then she went back to work. By the time Della was on her feet again, limping but functional 10 days after the accident, the cave had grown to 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide with a ceiling that cleared Vera's head by a comfortable foot. Not finished, not safe yet, but unmistakably a room. It was on the third day after Della returned to work that she found the horses. She had been gathering rose hips from the briars along the north meadow edge, moving slowly on account of her leg, when she crested a low rise and saw them grazing in the open grass below a small band of wild mustangs. Perhaps 12 animals spread across the autumn grass in the unhurried way of creatures who have not been pressured. One of them stopped her entirely. The mare was positioned slightly apart from the others. Her coat was the color of a coal fire seen through smoke, red gold and dark by turns depending on the angle of the light. She was built strongly with a deep chest and short cannons of mountain-bred stock, and she was carrying a foal that was close to term. Della stood on the rise for a long time without moving. When she came back to camp that evening, Vera was recording measurements by firelight. "There is a pregnant mare in the North Meadow," Della said. "A Mustang. She will foal within the month." Vera did not look up from the journal. "We do not have time." Della sat down across the fire. "We would have a horse for work and travel. The foal would grow up tame and useful, and 2 horses in the secondary chamber would add warmth through the worst of the winter." "We do not have time," Vera said again. Della was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That horse will foal in a blizzard with nowhere to shelter. She will die and the foal will die." She looked across the fire at her sister. "I am not asking for permission. I am telling you where I will be for 2 hours each morning." Vera looked up from the journal then. She looked at her sister's face, at the set of her jaw, and the steadiness of her eyes, and she registered something she had not fully seen before, not as a fact separate from everything she already knew about Della, but as something new, a quality that had been developing below her attention and had now become impossible to miss. Her little sister was not asking for permission because her little sister no longer needed to. 2 hours, Vera said, not more. 2 hours, Della agreed. What Vera did not say was that the moment had unsettled something in her in a way she did not entirely understand. She had carried her sister through the mountain the way you carry the most important thing you own carefully and with complete attention. And somewhere in these past weeks, while she had been focused on the stone and the cold and the shrinking margin between survival and its absence, Della had become someone who carried herself. She sat within that knowledge after Della slept and found it was not an unhappy thing exactly. Just a strange one. The kind of strangeness that comes from a world rearranging itself into a new shape. 20 miles south in Elhorn Creek, a different kind of rearrangement was underway. Reverend Edmund Holt sat across from Margaret Hale in the small office behind the pulpit, and between them on the oak desk lay a stack of papers that represented 8 years of careful preparation. Margaret Hale had written to the Territorial Land Office. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday and been intercepted by Holt's contact in the clerk's office on a Wednesday, and by Thursday Holt had known exactly what she had written and to whom. He had not been angry. He had been, if anything, admiring. He had underestimated Margaret Hale, which was a mistake he did not intend to repeat. The papers on the desk were a promissory note dated from 3 years earlier, at a time when Margaret's oldest son had been ill, and the medical cost had exhausted the farm's cash reserves. The debt had been held by a private lender in Missoula. Holt had purchased it in the spring of that year quietly through an intermediary and had been holding it with the patience of a man who understands that leverage is most valuable when it is not yet deployed. He explained the situation to Margaret with the courtesy he extended to all business discussions. He was not threatening her, he said. He was clarifying the landscape. Margaret looked at the papers. She was quiet for a long moment. "You bought this 3 years ago," she said. "Yes." The Whitfield girls were 14 and 16 years old 3 years ago. Holt said nothing. "You have been planning this since they were children," she said. He straightened one of the documents on the desk. "I think about the long-term welfare of this community. That requires planning." Margaret looked at him. The expression on her face was not the expression of a woman who has been defeated. It was the expression of a woman who now knows precisely what she is dealing with. "I will continue to correspond with the land office," she said. "I know you will," Holt said. She stood, gathered her coat, and left without another word. She walked the length of the main street in the thin October cold with her back straight and her face showing nothing. Outside the office window, pressed against the clapboard siding, in the narrow passage between the church and the woodshed, Samuel Holt stood without moving until he heard his father's footsteps cross the office floor toward the inner door. He had heard every word. He walked home in the late afternoon light and sat at the small desk in his room and opened the journal he had been keeping since he was 12 years old. He wrote for a long time. When he was finished, he read back what he had written. Then he closed the journal and sat with the window going dark in front of him. He had known about the Whitfield land for 2 years. He had known about his father's interest in the timber rights. He had known about the survey work and the legal research and the conversations with men at the land office in the capital. He had known all of it and had never asked a direct question about any of it because asking a direct question would have required him to hear a direct answer, and a direct answer would have required him to decide what to do with it. He had been choosing not to know. He understood that now with a completeness that was new and not comfortable. Walter Finch had told him something once, sitting on the bench outside the general store on a slow summer afternoon. Walter had been talking about tracking, about following sign through country where the animal you were following did not want to be found. He had said the hardest part is not finding the trail. The hardest part is being willing to follow it wherever it goes, even if it leads somewhere you did not want to go. Samuel thought about that for a long time. Then Arthur Grayson came home from his range inspection. That evening stood at the kitchen window looking out at his cattle and said to his wife Catherine, "This winter will be ordinary. I am certain of it." His son Owen, sitting at the table behind him, said nothing. He had been saying nothing about a great many things for several months. He was becoming expert at it. By the last week of November, Stonehaven was complete. The name had come from Della on a Tuesday evening when they were both too tired to speak much, and the fire was burning low, and the wind outside was doing something that had no good weather interpretation. She had looked around at the carved walls and the smooth floor, and the way the firelight moved across the red gold stone, and she had said simply, "Stonehaven." Vera had agreed with one word, and that had been that. The door had taken 4 days. Vera had cut the aspen logs herself from deadfall on the north slope, shaped them with the hand axe, fitted them into the frame she had carved into the entrance, and lined the inside surface with rabbit fur pressed into the gaps. It hung true and sealed tight, and when it was closed and the fire was lit, the cave stopped being a hole in a cliff and became something that functioned genuinely and practically as a home. They tested it on a cold night in mid-November when the outside temperature dropped to 18 degrees. The cave held 54 degrees without the fire. With a small fire burning, it reached 62 within the hour. Vera wrote both numbers in her journal without comment, but she wrote them in larger script than her usual notation, which was the closest she came to expressing satisfaction in writing. Ember foaled on a Tuesday morning during the first serious snowfall of the season. Della had been expecting it for 3 days. She had moved the mare into the secondary chamber a week earlier, a lower ceiling space off the main room that had originally been planned as additional storage. Ember had accepted the space with the equanimity of an animal that had been through enough wild winters to recognize shelter when she found it. The foal arrived just after dawn, small and damp and furious in the way of newborn horses, struggling to her feet with a determination that seemed excessive given that she had been in the world for approximately 4 minutes. Her coat, once it dried, was her mother's coloring, that coal-fire red gold that shifted with the light. Sparkdella said without discussion. Vera, who had been watching from the entrance to the secondary chamber, allowed herself something that was almost a smile. That night, with the fire burning the two horses in the side chamber and Flint stretched across the threshold, Vera sat against the stone wall and listened to the temperature outside drop toward zero. Inside the cave, the warmth pressed around her with a steadiness that no wooden building in Elkhorn Creek could match. The stone was doing what Josiah's grandfather had described in the journal, working quietly and without interruption, holding what the day had given and giving it back through the night. She thought about her father, not with grief exactly, which had done its main work in the months immediately after his death, but with something more like conversation. He had known this place, not this specific cliff face, but this category of place, the fold of the mountain, where the right stone offered the right shelter to someone who knew what to look for. He had written it down so she would know. She wondered if he had imagined she would need it this way. Under these circumstances, she decided it did not matter. He had given her what he could give and she had used it, and that was the entire meaning of inheritance, distilled to its most essential form. On the morning of December 10th, the storm arrived. It announced itself gradually, which was almost worse than if it had come all at once. Snow began falling through the morning hours in the ordinary way of early winter weather, and the people of Elkhorn Creek went about their routines with the confidence of a community that had managed many winters and expected to manage this one. By noon, the wind had increased, and the temperature had begun dropping in a way that did not follow the normal pattern of a storm front. By evening, the visibility had gone to zero, and the thermometer outside George Tate's general store read 5 below zero and was still falling. By midnight, it read 20 below. By the following noon, 35 below. By the second evening, the temperature passed 40 below, and the wind was driving the snow horizontally at 50 miles an hour. And the world outside the buildings of Elkhorn Creek had ceased to exist as a navigable space. This was not a winter storm. It was an Arctic outbreak, a river of polar air pouring south out of Canada, with nothing in the geography to slow it, no range, no break, nothing to moderate the fury of air that had been generated over ice fields 1,000 miles to the north. It would not last days. It would last weeks. Arthur Grayson stood at his kitchen window on the second morning and watched 200 head of cattle die. They died in the draws and the coulees where they had gathered seeking wind shelter. They died standing the cold, stopping their hearts before their legs gave freezing solid where they stood. He watched this happen and could not move from the window and could not speak. 20 years of careful husbandry, of selecting for hardiness and managing the range through every variable the territory had thrown at him. 200 animals in 2 days. By the end of the first week, the number would reach 400. Owen Grayson stood behind his father at the window and watched his father watch the cattle die. And he thought about the church meeting in September, about the moment he had started to rise from his chair and his father's eyes had found him and he had sat back down. He thought about all the things he had not said in the weeks since, the questions he had not asked, the observations he had not made. His father had needed him to be quiet, and he had been quiet, and 400 cattle were dying in the draws, and inside the house, his 8-year-old brother Benjamin had developed a cough 3 days ago that was getting worse instead of better. In the town itself, the wooden houses were failing the families inside them. The single-wall construction that had been adequate for ordinary Montana winters was no match for wind that found every gap and gap-adjacent weakness in every structure. Families were burning wood at 3 times their normal rate and watching their supplies disappear towards a bottom that was arriving faster than anyone had prepared for. On the fifth night, the roof of the Skaggs' house came down. The snow load had been accumulating for 4 days without the freeze-thaw cycles that normally prevented dangerous buildup. The roof had been built for normal winters. When the structure finally surrendered, it went quickly, the center beam cracking first, then the rafters giving in sequence, then everything in between. The family ran for the nearest neighbor through chest-deep drifts wearing what they had been sleeping in, leaving everything else behind. Billy Skaggs, who had bet $5 that the cave would collapse before Christmas arrived, at the Tate house shaking so badly he could not get his boots off for an hour. By the 6th day, the firewood situation in Elkhorn Creek had passed from concerning to desperate. George Tate burned his wooden display shelving on the 5th day. He was considering the counter on the 7th. The Ashford family, whose house was the largest and best built in town, began carefully dismantling their barn. On the 16th of December, Walter Finch walked out his front door. He had run out of wood sometime in the night, not from carelessness, but from a calculation that had not accounted for temperatures this far below zero sustained for this many consecutive days. He was not a man given to poor preparation. He had been storing firewood since September and had believed his stores were sufficient. They had not been. He put on every piece of clothing he owned. He wrapped his face until only his eyes showed. He opened the door, and the cold hit him. The way very cold air hits a person, not gradually but all at once, stealing the first breath before the body can prepare for the theft. His woodpile was 20 feet from his front door. 20 feet a distance he had covered 10,000 times without a second thought. He stepped outside. He took 2 steps, then 4, then 6. The snow was at mid-thigh and the wind was driving more snow horizontally and the visibility was absolute zero. A white void with no direction encoded in it, no up or down or left or right, just undifferentiated white in every direction. Walter Finch, who had navigated these mountains for 50 years by instinct, and accumulated knowledge, became completely disoriented within seconds of leaving his door. The wind took his sense of direction the moment he lost sight of the wall behind him, and once it was gone, there was no recovering it. They found his body in the spring, curled in the snow, 12 feet from his front door, 12 feet from warmth, from survival, from another morning. He was one of only 2 people in Elkhorn Creek who had believed the Whitfield sisters. He died without ever knowing whether they were alive. It was Samuel Holt who ran when the neighbor raised the alarm. Samuel who dug through the drifts until he found the shape of the old man in the snow. He knelt there for a long time without moving his hands, resting on the frozen coat, the wind screaming above him. Walter had told him something once. The hardest part is being willing to follow the trail wherever it goes. Samuel stood up. He went inside and he did not speak to anyone. He sat at his desk and he opened his journal to the last page he had written. And he read what he had recorded 2 months earlier on the evening after he had listened to his father speak to Margaret Hale through the office wall. He had written, "I have been choosing not to know. I understand that now." He closed the journal. He found his heaviest coat and his best boots and his warmest hat, and he put them all on. He picked up a small pack he had been quietly assembling over the previous week, not knowing exactly why, but understanding that preparation was not the same as planning, and that he was preparing for something. He did not tell his father he was leaving. He walked out into the white and turned north. He had a general direction and a desperate hope, in approximately 2 hours before the cold would make the decision for him. The wind hit him from the northwest, and he used it as a bearing, keeping it on his left cheek, moving as fast as he could manage through snow that was thigh-deep in the open and chest-deep in the hollows. After 90 minutes, he had not found the cliff formations. His feet had gone from painful to numb, which was the wrong progression. He found a rock overhang on a south-facing slope and pushed himself into it and pulled his knees to his chest and understood that he had failed. He was not going to make it back to town. He might not make it to morning. Then he heard something that was not wind, a low sound, almost a word from a direction he could not place. He turned his head. 3 feet away, sitting in the snow, as calmly as though it were a summer afternoon, was Flint. The wolf dog looked at Samuel with amber eyes that registered no surprise at finding a half-frozen boy in a rock overhang in a blizzard. He lifted his head and looked north for a moment. Then he looked back at Samuel. Samuel understood. He got to his feet. He followed Flint through the white for 20 minutes, moving faster than he should have been capable of matching the dog's pace, trusting completely. When the cliff face materialized out of the storm like something emerging from a dream, when the thin line of smoke became visible above the natural overhang, when the outline of the wooden door appeared in the red-gold sandstone, Samuel Holt stopped and stared. They had actually built it. He stood there in the howling white and looked at the door in the cliff and felt something restructure itself inside his chest. Some foundational assumption about what was possible and who was capable of the possible, and how badly he had misunderstood both. He raised his hand to knock. The door opened. Vera Whitfield stood in the entrance. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, the warmth from the cave pressed outward into the cold, and Flint walked past both of them and lay down by the fire as though he had been doing this every day for weeks. "How many children?" Vera said. It was not a greeting, it was the question that mattered. Samuel had to think. His mind was still partially frozen, or something that felt like freezing. 31, he said. Maybe 31 still alive. Vera turned and looked at her sister. Della was already on her feet. Vera looked back at Samuel. "Come inside," she said. "You will tell us everything. And then tomorrow, before it gets light, we are going back out there." Samuel talked for a long time that night. He sat close to the fire with a blanket around his shoulders and the color coming slowly back into his face, and he told him everything in the flat, careful voice of someone who has decided that accuracy matters more than comfort. 33 people dead in and around Elkhorn Creek. The Skaggs family sheltering at the Tate House after their roof came down. Dr. Sloan trapped under his own collapsed ceiling with 2 broken legs, no surgery possible. No one with the knowledge to set the bones properly. The wood supplies in most homes at critical levels are already gone. The Ashford family burning their barn board by board. The church where his father had barricaded himself on the 3rd day of the storm was the only structure that had not yet lost its roof. And Benjamin Grayson, 8 years old, had been running a fever for 3 days. The fever had not broken. His lips had been turning blue when Samuel left the Grayson house 6 hours ago. When he finished, the cave was quiet except for the fire and the sound of the wind working at the door. Vera asked him one question. How many of the 31 children are able to walk? Samuel thought, maybe 20. The younger ones would need to be carried. Benjamin could not be moved without a stretcher. Vera looked at Della. Della was already pulling the food stores from the alcove, counting, calculating. We have enough for 2 weeks if we ration to 60 people, Della said. The spring has not frozen. She paused, her hands still on the provisions. It will be close. Vera nodded once. Then she looked at Samuel. You will sleep now. A few hours. Before first light, we go to the Grayson house first, and then we bring them all here. Every person who will come. Samuel looked at her across the fire. He had the expression of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has just been told he can set it down, but does not yet fully trust the ground. Why, he said, after what we did to you. Vera was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted, and the shadows moved on the carved stone walls. My father used to say that the mountain does not keep score, she said. It only keeps track of who is prepared and who is not. She reached for her coat. We have been keeping track. Get some sleep, Samuel. He did not argue. He lay down near the fire with Flint pressed against his back, and within 10 minutes his breathing had changed to the deep rhythm of someone who has finally stopped fighting the exhaustion. Della watched him sleep for a moment, then looked at her sister. His father, she said quietly. I know, Vera said. They did not say more than that. The rescue took 3 days. On the first morning, Vera and Samuel and Owen Grayson broke trail through 5-foot drifts from Stonehaven to the Grayson ranch house while Della prepared the cave to receive people. It took 4 hours to cover 4 miles. The cold had moderated, slightly settling at 30 below. Without the wind that had made the previous days unsurvivable, and 30 below without wind was merely brutal rather than immediately fatal, which was the margin they had to work with. Owen had been watching for them from the window. He came out of the house before they reached the porch, and the look on his face when he saw Vera Whitfield walking through the snow toward him was not the look of a man who has been rescued. It was the look of a man confronting the specific shape of his own failure. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Benjamin is worse." Vera went inside. Catherine Grayson was sitting with the boy by the stove, which was burning the last of what had been a substantial woodpile. Benjamin lay with his head in his mother's lap, breathing in the shallow, labored way of a child whose lungs are losing the argument with something they should not have had to fight. His lips had the faint blue tinge that Samuel had described. Vera knelt beside him and put her hand on his forehead and his chest in turn. She did not speak her diagnosis out loud. She looked at Della's herb pack which she had brought and began working. Arthur Grayson was standing at the kitchen window with his back to the room. He was looking out at the north field where his cattle had been, which was now an unbroken white surface with no indication that anything had ever lived there. He heard Vera come in. He heard her move to his son. He did not turn around. When Vera had done what she could do for Benjamin and had given Catherine the instructions for the next 12 hours, she stood and looked at Arthur's back. "Mr. Grayson," she said. He turned slowly. His face had aged in a way that had nothing to do with the passage of days. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been living inside a very specific kind of reckoning. "I know what I owe you," he said. The words came out with difficulty, not because he was unwilling to say them, but because the scale of the debt had not yet found its proper language. "I know that there is no accounting that makes this right." Vera looked at him steadily. "We need to move Benjamin to the cave. We need to move your family. Then we go back for the others. There are 31 children in that town and every hour matters." Arthur nodded. He did not say anything further. He moved to the closet for his coat, and in the simple act of turning from the window and beginning to do what needed to be done, something settled in the room. Owen was already helping his mother wrap Benjamin in every blanket they had. Before Vera and Owen stepped back outside, Arthur pulled Owen to one side. "Why did you not tell me?" he said. His voice was low. Owen looked at his father directly for the first time since September. "Because you looked at me the way you did in that church," he said, "and I chose to keep your good opinion instead of speaking the truth. That was my failure as much as yours." Arthur was silent for a moment. The two men stood in the narrow hallway with the cold pressing in at the doorframe. "We have both made mistakes," Arthur said finally. Owen nodded. "Yes. The question now is what we do with whatever time we have left." Arthur put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Then they went outside. The second and third days were the work of a community coming apart at the seams and being held together by two women and the infrastructure they had built with their hands in the autumn. Vera and Owen made 4 trips between Elkhorn Creek and Stonehaven over those 2 days, following the trail they had broken and widening it on each pass. Samuel knew the town well enough to identify which families were in the worst condition, and he moved between the houses in the calmer periods, between wind gusts, finding people, telling them what was available, helping those who could walk toward the northern trail. Some came immediately grateful for any direction at all. Others came reluctantly, wrapping their pride around themselves like an inadequate coat on the way out the door. A few refused entirely. Agnes Calloway, who had spent the past 3 months telling anyone who would listen that the Whitfield sisters were dangerous and strange, arrived at Stonehaven on the second evening, carrying her 14-year-old son on her back. His feet were badly frostbitten, the toes dark and the flesh hard in the way that meant the damage was serious and permanent recovery uncertain. Della was the one who came to her. Agnes was sitting against the far wall of the cave with her son's feet in her lap, as far from the center of activity as the space allowed. She had not spoken to anyone since she arrived. She was not crying. She was past the stage where crying was available to her. She sat with the expression of a woman who has been stripped of every defense and has arrived at the bare fact of herself. Della sat down in front of her without any preamble. She looked at the boy's feet, then at Agnes's face. "Let me see what we are working with," she said. Agnes lifted her son's feet without a word. Her hands were shaking, not from cold. Della worked for 20 minutes cleaning and wrapping, speaking softly to the boy. When he flinched, telling him what she was doing before she did it. When she finished, she looked at Agnes. "The 3 middle toes on the right foot," she said. "The left foot is better. He will keep most of it if we manage the next week carefully. Agnes looked at her son's wrapped feet. A sound came out of her that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, something from below the level where language operates. Della waited a moment. Then she said, I need you to change these wrappings every 6 hours and tell me immediately if the color changes. Can you do that? Agnes looked up. Yes, she said. Her voice was barely there. Della handed her the materials. She stood and moved to the next person who needed her, and she did not look back, and Agnes Calloway sat in the corner of the cave, holding her son's wrapped feet, and understood with a particular clarity that comes from being helped by someone you have wronged exactly what she had been and what it had cost. It was on the afternoon of the second rescue day that Vera and Owen made the trip to the church. They found Holt in the sanctuary. He was seated in the chair behind the pulpit, wrapped in the altar cloth, his face turned toward the broken window, where the light came in gray and cold. His fingers were black at the tips. His lips had the dark coloring of sustained exposure. He was alive, but the margin was narrowing. Samuel had wanted to come. Vera had told him to stay at Stonehaven, and he had looked at her with an expression that told her he understood why, without needing it explained. Some conversations need to happen without witnesses. Vera stood in the aisle. Owen waited near the door. Reverend Holt, she said. He turned his head slowly. When he saw who was standing in his church, something moved through his face that was too complicated to name simply. It was not gratitude, and it was not shame, though it contained elements of both. It was the expression of a man who has been entirely consistent in his beliefs and is now required to measure that consistency against its consequences. There is room, Vera said. Warmth, food, come with us. Holt looked at her for a long moment. His breath made small clouds in the frozen air of the sanctuary. I will not follow the daughters of a godless man, he said. His voice was steadier than his condition suggested it should be. Vera did not argue theology with him. She did not remind him what he had done or enumerate the ways in which his godliness had expressed itself over the past years. She was not there to win an argument. She was there to offer a door, and the door was open, and what he did with it was between him and whatever he believed in. The walk back is 4 miles, she said. If you decide to come, the door at Stonehaven will be open. She looked at him one more time. I hope you choose to live, Reverend. She turned and walked back down the aisle. Owen fell in beside her as she reached the door. They were 50 yards from the church in the snow when Owen spoke. Should we have forced him? No, Vera said. Owen was quiet for a moment. They kept walking. He will die. Yes, she said. He has decided that already. We cannot decide it differently for him. Owen did not respond. He walked beside her through the white and processed what she had said, which was not a piece of wisdom he had been raised with, but which he recognized in the way you recognize a true thing, even when it is new to you, as correct. That same evening, Samuel went alone to the church. He had not told Vera he was going. He had waited until she was occupied with the medical rotations, and then he had taken his coat and walked the mile back to town in the dying light. He found his father exactly as Vera had described him. Holt looked at his son entering the church without surprise, as though he had been expecting this visit, even if he could not have said why. Samuel sat down in the front pew facing his father across the cold sanctuary. Come with me, he said. Holt looked at him. In a long moment of silence, something moved behind the Reverend's eyes that was different from what Vera had seen. With Vera, there had been the performance of conviction. With Samuel, the performance fell away. I have done wrong things, Holt said. His voice was very quiet. He was not speaking to argue or defend. He was speaking because his son was the only person left who deserved the truth from him. Samuel waited. I wanted that land from the day Josiah Whitfield filed his claim, Holt said. Told myself for 20 years that the community's welfare required a strong church, that a strong church required resources, that those resources were being wasted on a man who lived outside the community's values. I had an answer for everything. He paused. That is the danger of an intelligent man who has decided what he wants. He can justify anything. Samuel said nothing for a moment. Then come with me anyway. Holt shook his head slowly. Not because of pride, he said, though there is still some of that, but because I am not certain I deserve what those girls built. I am not certain that my presence among the people I harmed would be a gift to them. Samuel stood. He looked at his father for a long time. You are the only parent I have left, he said, and you are choosing to in a frozen church rather than live and be accountable. That is the last thing you will teach me. I hope you understand what it is. He walked out. The altar cloth, Holt's handwritten sermons from 11 years of Sundays, the wooden cross that had hung behind the pulpit since the church was built. All of it burned in the following days as the temperature continued its work. They found him in the spring, seated in his chair in frozen solid, the Bible open in his lap, to a page in Proverbs that someone read aloud to the gathered survivors. He had not moved from that chair. He had been entirely consistent to the end. Samuel, when he returned to Stonehaven that evening, sat by the fire for a long time without speaking. He did not cry. He had used up what he had available for his father some months before this day. What remained was something quieter and more permanent, the kind of grief that does not announce itself, but instead becomes part of the architecture of a person load-bearing and invisible. Vera sat down beside him after a while. She did not offer comfort in words. She simply stayed until the fire burned low and the cave settled into the breathing quiet of 68 people asleep in a space built for two. By December 22nd, 68 people were sheltering in Stonehaven. Vera had organized the space with the same precision she had applied to excavating it. Families with young children occupied the warmest zone near the back wall. The injured and sick were positioned close to the fire. The able-bodied adults rotated through the work schedules she had written on a piece of bark and nailed to the wall beside the door of fire. Watch door, watch water from the spring, food preparation, medical assistance for Della. Benjamin Grayson's fever broke on Christmas morning. It broke between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, while most of the cave slept, and Della sat beside him doing what she had been doing for 6 days, managing his temperature, giving him the preparations she had made, keeping him from the edge by increments so small that each individual one was barely visible, but which accumulated over 6 days into a life that continued. When he woke, his color was back. His eyes were clear. He looked around at the carved stone ceiling and the sleeping shapes of 67 people and the dying fire with the uncomplicated curiosity of an 8-year-old who has been sick and is now not sick and finds the world interesting again. He looked at Della. "Where's the dog?" he asked. Flint was asleep near the door. At the sound of his name, used by implication, he raised his head, assessed the situation, and walked over to Benjamin with the dignity of an animal that has decided this particular child is worth the trouble. He lay down with his head across the boy's legs. Benjamin laughed. It was the first genuine laugh in Stonehaven since the storm began, and it moved through the sleeping room the way that sound moves through water, reaching people before they were fully awake, pulling them toward consciousness with something that was not an alarm. Catherine Grayson woke with tears already on her face without knowing why. Arthur Grayson, who had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in a week, opened his eyes and heard his son laughing and lay still for a long moment looking at the stone ceiling before he trusted himself to move. Owen was sitting near the door on fire watch. He heard the laugh and he looked at Vera, who was standing a few feet away, and neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said that the sound had not already communicated. It was Christmas in a cave in the mountains of Montana without decorations or ceremony or anything that the people of Elkhorn Creek would have recognized as celebration 2 months before. It was also for reasons that had nothing to do with tradition and everything to do with the fact of 68 people still breathing in the same room, something that would be remembered for the rest of their lives as Christmas in a way that the comfortable Christmases before it never quite would be. The storm broke on January 2nd, 1887. After 24 days of continuous assault, the wind simply stopped. Not gradually, not with diminishing gusts, but completely the way a sound stops when the source is removed. The clouds thinned and then parted, and a pale winter sun appeared over the mountains in a sky that was the clear, hard blue of extreme cold without weather. Vera unsealed the door and stepped outside for the first time in 12 days. The cold was still serious, perhaps 25 below, But without the wind, it was survivable in a way the previous weeks had not been. The valley below lay under 7 feet of snow, with drifts that had swallowed fence lines and transformed familiar terrain into something alien. The trees on the north slope carried loads of white that bent the younger ones to the ground. The world had been remade. She stood in front of the cave entrance and breathed the frozen air and looked at what the season had built in its weeks of work, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. She felt her father beside her, not literally, not as anything she would have described as supernatural, just as a presence shaped by years of his teaching and his example, the accumulated weight of everything he had tried to give her standing with her in the cold. The way that the people we have loved and lost continue to stand with us in the moments that matter, not because they are there, but because we carry them. She stood with that for a while, then she went inside to begin preparing for the journey back. The return to Elkhorn Creek took most of a day. 68 people moving through 7 feet of snow in a long column, the able-bodied taking turns at the front to break trail the injured on improvised sleds the children carried on backs or riding Ember and Spark. Flint ranged ahead and to the sides, reading the terrain for the group the way he had done for Vera and Della all autumn. They reached the town in the early afternoon. What they found did not surprise Vera. She had built her preparations on the assumption of exactly this level of destruction, had spent the autumn calculating the worst and building for it, and now the worst was laid out before her exactly as she had calculated. Roofs collapsed, walls buckled, the church still standing but stripped of its steeple, doors hanging open on houses that had been abandoned when the wood ran out. They found Holt on January 4th during the systematic search of every building. He was as he had left himself, seated and frozen and at peace in a way his living face had rarely managed. Someone read the Proverbs passage aloud. No one commented. The final count of the dead reached 38, 33 before and during the evacuation, plus 5 more who had either refused to leave or had been unreachable in the worst days of the storm. Dr. Sloan was among them, having survived the collapsed roof and the broken legs, but not the infection that followed without medicine or proper care. 70 people had lived. The gathering happened the following week in the cleared area before the ruined church because the church was the largest open space available. And because there was something fitting which everyone felt without discussing about holding this particular meeting in view of the building where so much of what needed to be addressed had originated. Arthur Grayson spoke first. He stood before the people he had led and advised for 35 years, and he did not use the language of qualification or the grammar of partial admission. He said what he had done. He had stood in that church in September and called the Whitfield sisters ignorant. He had used his position to confirm what the room wanted to believe. He had helped take their land and drive them into the wilderness to die. And every word he had spoken with such certainty had been the product of a man who needed his ignorance to be wisdom, because the alternative was a reckoning he was not prepared to face. His voice broke once near the end. He let it break and continued. He turned to face Vera and Della directly. He said he did not know how to make an apology adequate to what had been done. He said that his son was alive because of them. He said that he would spend whatever years remained to him trying to be worthy of that. Others spoke. George Tate, Billy Skaggs, who had lost his house and his certainty simultaneously and was still finding his way through the rubble of both. Owen briefly in the plain language of someone who has decided that clarity matters more than self-protection. He said he had known enough to help and had chosen not to, and that the choice had been cowardice dressed as discretion, and that he intended to be different. Agnes Calloway stood when the others had finished. She did not speak about the winter or the cold or the things she had failed to prepare. She spoke about the lies she had spread about the Whitfield mother's death, the story she had told and retold through the valley for years, the story that had no basis in fact and every basis in her own fear of what the Whitfield family represented to her understanding of the world. She said she had been afraid of people who were different from her in ways she could not name, and that her fear had made her cruel, and that she was sorry for the specific and nameable harm she had done. The silence after she sat down was different from the silences that had come before it. It was the silence of a community recognizing itself in an accounting. Vera had been listening to all of it from where she stood with Della at the edge of the gathering. She had been watching faces, reading the room the way her father had taught her to read weather, measuring what was real against what was performed. When the last person had spoken, she stepped forward. She was not yet 20 years old. She spoke without notes and without the oratorical conventions that Holt had modeled. No prepared cadences, no rhetorical peaks. She spoke the way her father had written in his journal, practically and with precision about things that were true. She said she did not forgive them. She said that was honest, and that honesty was more useful to everyone present than a forgiveness she would have to manufacture. She said that forgiveness, if it came, would come in time through the accumulation of days and actions, and that she was not going to promise a thing she was not yet capable of delivering. She said that her father had spent his life trying to give his knowledge to people who did not want it, and that the knowledge had saved their lives anyway, because that is what true knowledge does. It saves you whether or not you believed in it. She said that the knowledge was available to anyone who wanted to learn it now. She paused. She looked at the faces before her, at the survivors of a winter that had been exactly as severe as she had predicted and not 1 degree less. My father taught me that the mountain does not care about our pride. It does not know our names or our positions or our certainties. It knows only what we have prepared and what we have not. She looked across the gathered faces. I am going to teach you what he taught me. Every sign, every method, everything he wrote in that journal, and everything I have learned since. Not because you deserve it, because the knowledge deserves to be passed on, because that is what knowledge is for. Della stepped up beside her then, and Vera understood without anything being said that her sister intended to speak. Della held the journal. Their father's journal, 300 handwritten pages of a man's lifetime of watching and learning and recording. Our father used to say that the mountains have no mercy, Della said. He was right. They do not. She looked at the crowd, her voice steady and clear in the cold air. But we do not have to be like the mountains. We can choose to be different. We can choose to help even those who have hurt us. We can choose to build something better than what was here before. She held up the journal. This is everything he knew, and we are going to share it with all of you, starting today if you want. She opened the journal. She began to read. The Whitfield land was returned in the spring. The Territorial Land Office, when the roads were passable enough for travel and the documentation could be filed properly, found no irregularity whatsoever in Josiah Whitfield's original homestead claim. The questions about improper filing had been manufactured from nothing by a man who wanted what did not belong to him and who was no longer alive to defend the fabrication. Arthur Grayson provided a sworn statement. Deputy Thomas Wren provided another. The claim was settled by May. 23 new earth-sheltered structures went up across the valley before the following autumn. Not caves, most of them, but root cellars and storm shelters and reinforced outbuildings built on the principles that Vera had spent the winter teaching to anyone who came to Stonehaven to learn. They came in steady numbers through the spring and summer families and individual ranchers, and a few people from neighboring valleys who had heard what had survived the great winter and what had not. Vera taught with the precision of her father and the patience of someone who has learned the difference between knowledge that is given and knowledge that is received. Arthur Grayson was among her most consistent students. He rebuilt his herd slowly over years, without the borrowed certainty that had characterized his earlier operations. He never lost the habit he had developed of consulting Vera before each winter, not because she demanded it, but because he had learned at significant cost the value of asking questions before the storm rather than after. Owen did not make it easy for himself. He came to Stonehaven as a student like the others and worked without expectation of special treatment, because he understood that expecting special treatment was precisely what had gotten him to where he was. He worked through 2 summers on projects that Vera needed completed, never asking for acknowledgement, occasionally receiving it when it was genuinely earned. In the spring of 1892, he asked her to marry him. She said no in a sentence that explained itself completely without requiring elaboration. She did not need to be rescued, she said, and she did not need to be completed. and she had survived things that would have killed most men, and she had done it by her own design. And what he was describing sounded like what those things were not what she was looking for. Owen said he understood. He said he was not offering rescue and he was not offering completion. He said there was a difference between standing beside someone and standing in front of them, and that the second was what she had described and the first was what he meant. She told him to ask her again in the spring. He asked her again in the spring of 1893. She said yes. The wedding was held at Stonehaven in the cleared area before the cave entrance because it was the right place and both of them knew it without discussing it. Margaret Hale was the witness. Della stood beside her sister, wearing their mother's silver bracelet on her wrist, which caught the spring light, and threw small pieces of it across the red gold sandstone. And if anyone noticed that she cried through most of the ceremony, they had the good grace to say nothing. Flint lay at Vera's feet throughout. He was old by then, gray across most of his muzzle, his pace slower on the long walks. He had another 6 years in him before he died in the summer of 1899 at the age of 16, which was an extraordinary age for what he was, and which the people who knew him attributed variously to stubbornness, constitution, and the fact that he had never quite accepted the idea that his job was finished. They buried him at the entrance to Stonehaven with a small stone marker that Vera carved herself. It said what was true. He kept watch so we could rest. Samuel Holt stayed in Elkhorn Creek. He did not become a minister, which was what his father had planned, and which he had once assumed was the shape his life would take. He became a teacher instead, opening a small school in the rebuilt community building and keeping it running for the next 4 decades on the combination of stubbornness and genuine love for the work that good teachers share. He taught reading and arithmetic and history. He also taught every year without exception the signs that the natural world uses to communicate what the weather is planning, because he believed that knowledge should be required rather than optional, and because he had watched Walter Finch die 20 feet from his front door and had never stopped carrying that image. His students remembered him for his patience and for the way he listened, which was the way of someone who understood at a cellular level that the failure to listen has consequences. Deputy Thomas Wren retired from his position in 1908. He said nothing public at the time of his retirement about the role he had played in the autumn of 1886. He had said nothing public about it at any other point either. But on the 30th of September each year from 1887 until the day he retired, a bundle of good firewood appeared outside the door of Stonehaven before first light unsplit, unwrapped, unsigned. Vera knew whose hands had cut and stacked it. She had known since the second time it appeared. She never mentioned it to anyone, not because she was indifferent to it, but because she understood that some acts of decency are meant to exist without being named and that naming them would diminish what they were. Della Whitfield never left the mountain. She had visitors who became students and students who became teachers in their own right, and she sent them out into the American West with the skills she had learned and the patience she had been born with and the philosophy she had arrived at through years of living close to wild things, that the space between a human and an animal, like the space between any 2 different kinds of people, is not a problem to be solved, but a distance to be crossed with honesty and time. She outlived her sister by 4 years. She outlived Owen by 7. She was the last person to live in Stonehaven as a home rather than a landmark, and she died in the winter of 1941 at the age of 72 in the cave she had helped carve from living rock when she was 17 years old. She died in the same bed she had slept in for 55 years, in the warmth that the stone walls had been generating and releasing through every night of those 55 years, which was precisely the warmth that she and Vera had built it to hold. Her last request was that she be buried on the hillside beside her parents and her sister. They carried her up in the cold and put her in the ground next to Vera, and the stone above her said only her name and the years of her life, because the people who buried her felt that her life said everything else about itself that needed to be said. Vera Whitfield Grayson had died in the spring of 1937 at the age of 70. In her sleep in the bed Owen had built for them in the cave that had been her answer to everything the winter of 1886 had asked of her. She had lived long enough to see the techniques she had taught become standard practice across Montana. She had lived long enough to see researchers from the state university come to Stonehaven with measuring instruments and thermometers and notebooks and confirm, in the language of modern science, what Josiah Whitfield's grandfather had written by hand in a coal trapper's cabin 80 years before them. She had lived long enough to watch her father's knowledge become the community's knowledge, which had always been the only thing it was ever waiting to become. Above the entrance to Stonehaven, carved into the sandstone in letters that had been cut with the same hunting knife that Josiah had carried for 20 years and that Vera had worn at her hip on the morning she walked into George Tate's general store, with a warning that nobody wanted to hear, there is an inscription. It is still there. The stone has weathered, but the letters hold. People come from considerable distances to read them. The animals warned us. We warned them. Now all of us know. Below that, in smaller letters that appear to have been carved by a different hand perhaps years later, perhaps by someone who felt that the first inscription, while true, was incomplete. The ones we cast out were the ones who saved us. Remember that?